Hello and welcome to the MECERN podcast. This is the podcast where we talk to MECERN members and associates about their current and recent research into the medieval world of Central Europe. I'm Karen Culver, and today I'm meeting with Jessica Knowles to talk about her research into Revelations in Glass, Nuremberg's Apocalyptic Window. Jessica is currently completing her PhD at the University of Vienna. Her research focuses on apocalyptic glass windows in late medieval Europe, with a case study comparing a window in Nuremberg with that of All Saints in York in the north of England. Jessica analyses the window's images using narratology, iconography, and light and sound studies. Before returning to academia, Jessica worked in the Austrian wine industry, and a good wine is an interest she maintains outside her academic world even today. Jessica, welcome to the MECERN podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Today, as I said, we will be talking about a medieval window showing the 15 signs of the apocalypse in a church in Nuremberg. Please, as a basic background, in which church is the window? How big is it? Approximately when was it made? And most importantly, for the uninitiated like me, what were these signs of the apocalypse?
It's in the church of St. Martha, the former pilgrim's hospice in Nuremberg. It's quite big, bigger than your normal parish church, but not quite as big as a cathedral window. It was made in the late 14th century, probably around 1388, maybe as early as 1382. And the 15 signs differ depending on where you are, but roughly the seas rise, the seas fall, animals and fish roar, the seas burn, dew falls from the trees, bloody dew or golden dew depending on where you're looking, buildings fall, there's earthquakes, the land flattens, people go into caves, people come out of caves but they can't understand each other. The bones rise from the ground, the stars fall from the sky, everybody dies, the world burns. The order differs a bit between different depictions, both in text and in windows, but that's roughly what happens.
Where did these signs originate, and why 15? Because that's an odd number.
It is an odd number. The earliest texts we have surviving, there are 7. The Apocalypse of Thomas. These 7 aren't exactly the same. It's not like they're the first half, but they're quite similar in terms of it has a focus on natural disasters. Then later, in the early medieval period, around the 8th century, we have a text not from Bede. It was thought to be from Bede. Now we say pseudo-Bede, in which we find all 15. There's quite a lot in English and Irish texts that survive. Then on the European continent, we have from the 12th century onwards different versions. They seem to become more popular. Again, that's a source survival potentially. Then from the late medieval period, really popular. So not the plague, just before the Black Death. We have them in windows, we have them in books, we have picture books, or we have textual, we have poems with them. And they really continue. They're even in Shakespeare. So they're really, really quite popular.
So there were originally 7, as in 7 days of creation. Then that multiplied into 15. There's also the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So we're into all sorts of different numbers here. Is there any relationship between the 15 days of the apocalypse and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse? Because they seem to have very, very different approaches.
So the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are in the Book of Apocalypse. So they're very much biblical. The 15 days aren't in the Bible. There are indications in Matthew that Jesus spoke about them, but he doesn't set them out there. They're really a later creation. They're not biblical in their form. They're not very similar to Revelations, really. Revelations can be very supernatural. Angels pour in vials, the 4 horsemen, the 4 living creatures surrounding God and singing and speaking. The 15 last days are very much based in natural disasters, so you can kind of imagine them happening. There's supernatural elements, there's a supernatural cause, but they're not this dramatic four horsemen thundering across the landscape. They're very much familiar, localized often. The things you can imagine happening to you, rather than the four horsemen you kind of imagine happening in a biblical land far, far away.
What was the actual origins of these 15 horrible things happening which precede the apocalypse?
We don't really know. We don't even know if they precede the apocalypse. You can think of them happening in the middle of Revelations, but they don't have to be on subsequent days. So you could have one and then half of Revelations happens, then you have the next one. There's indications in some of the late medieval texts that is how they were understood, that you'd kind of intersperse them with the biblical events. 15, we have no idea why. I don't think anybody writes anything about this. So yeah, I don't know.
You said initially that the apocalypse window in Nuremberg was in St. Martha's hospice, in the chapel, I presume. Now, if I was in a hospice, I would be wanting happy, positive images. Why did they have the images of the apocalypse there?
I think it is kind of a happy image. If you think about the apocalypse, it's about salvation. It's about good people being saved. It's an end to the suffering of the world. So in many ways, all depictions of the apocalypse are quite positive because they're talking about your salvation. This is how you achieve your salvation. It's like a spur to behave better, a spur to do spiritual acts of mercy. It's actually a good thing.
So you have images of the sea rising and the land falling. And you say they were popular images and they were perceived as happy?
It's difficult to say how they were perceived. They were definitely a spur to better behaviour. But yeah, popular they were in windows, in block books, so people would buy them. They would have them in their house. Late 15th century onwards, they're in the most popular poem in late medieval England. They're really, maybe there's some form of drama. It's difficult to say for certain what people were thinking when they saw them, but they definitely seem to have liked to see them.
There doesn't seem to be anything of the threat, and there seems to be nothing of the stick and carrot.
I mean, the people often look quite scared in the images, so they are, but then they're also often praying. So you do have that. You have that idea of if these things are happening to you, you need to trust in God, you need to believe in Jesus, you need to believe in the resurrection, and you will be saved. So it's like when bad things are happening, trust in God.
You're saying they were popular, even though perhaps more are recorded in England from the pseudo-bead. But there are other places showing them in Central Europe. Where in Central Europe are they?
In terms of stained glass, they're only in Nuremberg, in Central Europe. They're also in the glass in Alsace and in Angers, so in France. There is one surviving panel from Frankfurt Oder, so that is Central Europe, but it's only one. We only have the fourth or the fifth day. And that's really the problem with stained glass in Central Europe. It just hasn't survived as well as England or France because of the various wars, invasions, etc.
Yeah, that sort of figures. Maybe if you've got stained glass showing earthquakes, then the stained glass might get shattered by an earthquake.
Yeah, again, there's stained glass showing floods in places where it did flood. So you can think of people seeing the floods through the glass that's showing the flood, and their reaction to that, it then becomes much more visceral, I think.
Can you tell us more about the local of this, the differences? For example, Nuremberg, what specific images are there?
Nuremberg's quite interesting, quite different, because we're talking about it as if it's the 15 last days window, but it actually only shows 14 in this window, and then the 15th is the last judgment window, which was originally the neighbouring window. So that in that way, you're creating this narrative that moves across the whole church, or the whole east end of the church. This doesn't happen in other depictions. In other depictions, to the best that we know, all 15 appear in the window, so it's a contained story. In the Nuremberg one, it's part of this historical story that starts with the Old Testament and then moves around the east end of the church. with the 15 last days window, with the 14 in it, being the penultimate window. Then the Last Judgment ends this story with the 15th day, and everybody gets judged. The damned go to hell, the saved go to heaven, the earth is destroyed.
So it wasn't just a window on its own.
No, definitely not.
It was within a context.
Yeah, all of them are within a context. If you think of the York one, it's interacting with the Revelation narrative across the chancel. So in that church, it's interacting in a slightly different way, but they're always within this context. They're within these schemes. The one in Frankfurt, there is also a Life of Antichrist in the glass, which survives in a much more full form. So they're within these apocalyptic stories. They're not just the 15 last days. They're always connected in some way from what we can see in the surviving evidence. Angers is particularly interesting because there's a tapestry cycle of slightly earlier. So you've got these tapestries quite possibly in the castle there, and then you go to the church and then you see another apocalypse depiction. So then in that way, that's using the space, potentially the whole town. So they're never alone. It's never just the 15 last days. It's always within a wider context, as far as we know from the evidence.
That, to me, would imply that when the windows were created, it was all done in one foul swoop, one mega plan. Is that reasonable?
I would say so, yes, but it's difficult to prove. Richard Emerson talks about illuminated apocalypse manuscripts, so it's the manuscript, it's not the glass. But he talks about this idea of a scholar advisor. So you had the people who paid for them, but they would then have this advisor who would be maybe university educated, maybe he would be a canon or a friar or something. And he would then advise the donors, this is an appropriate thing to have. This would be a good idea. This works well with this. In the Nuremberg context, they all seem to have been glazed, these 5 windows that show the Old Testament to the Last Judgment, at the same time. Paid for by different families, they have the coats of arms of different families, but the fact that it's all pretty much at the same time definitely suggests some kind of scheme, possibly by the family who paid for the chapel itself, possibly by a priest. We don't know for certain, but it just seems so unlikely that there wasn't this guide in hand.
Were all the families from the same guild?
They were all kind of the oligarchic families, the patrician families in the city council. Some were newer families, but they were all very wealthy, very established in the city. It's a status symbol as well. Giving a stained glass window has to be a status symbol because it's so expensive. Then when you add in the heraldry in there as well, you add in the donor figures, it's very much about them as well.
Now there's something I didn't realise. So you've actually got the donors of the window in the window.
Yeah, the bottom row is the donors kneeling with their heraldry and then with their arms, and they're praying, they're asking with the window for prayers for their souls. So they're getting something really quite tangible. It seems supernatural, but it's actually quite tangible benefit from giving the window, as well as they make the church look nicer, they help the souls of the pilgrims, they're also helping their own souls.
Thinking about they're always here they're in a window. How does the frame of the window work with the storytelling? Because if you've got a book, you can expand or contract. How does it work in a window?
Well, this window does read like a book. Not all windows do, but this window, it starts at the top left-hand corner, you read across, and then you read down. The one in York does the opposite, though. You read from the bottom upwards. There's also there's remnants of an inscription around the edge. So it's also interacting with text in the window. We don't know exactly what the inscription said. In York, we do. In York, we do have the inscriptions that sometimes they describe the days, but they don't always exactly describe what's in the image. They add this sense of temporality, so you know it's this day, this day, this day with the inscriptions. But they also tell a slightly different story sometimes. So they're adding to the story or they're creating interest. It's interesting that all of the 15 last days windows that we have text for have text in the vernacular, which is very rare. In England, it's in Middle English. In Nuremberg and in Alsace, it's in German. So it's not this elitist clerical Latin language. It's still elitist because you have to be able to read, or someone can read it to you. But it's more connected to the familiar, the daily life. If you have it in the vernacular, you're making it much more localized. It's not in a biblical distant land. It's in your your town, your village, wherever you're living.
So were the pictures as they are shown of the local town, can you see the churches that people would have recognised?
In York, definitely. There is the actual church that the window is in is falling down when the buildings fall down. Some of them are absolutely not. So there's a illuminated manuscript with the 15 last days, and that has mermaids.
Where was that made?
We don't know for certain, but possibly in the French Alps.
You're right.
There's not many mermaids there. No, they're not. No. They're not in the middle of the sea. If you're thinking of a mermaid, it's probably not in the Alps. In the Nuremberg, this seems to be not so localized because it's a very barren land and it's quite mountainous. This could be drawing on Revelations where one of the passages talks about the soil dying. So it could be that they're trying to show that, or it could be this biblical idea, sun-soaked land, often quite barren. There's various localities given, some of them real, some we can identify, some of them less real, but they're all in this kind of far-off land. Their people are dressed in the local dress, so they're dressed the same as the donors. They're not put in like some foreign clothing, which you don't really see anyway. Local clothing is normally used, so that's not so unusual. But when you bring all these things together, the buildings are the same, the land is often the same. It definitely seems like these are happening around you. Then you add the vernacular, that also adds to this sense of a very local disaster, blessing, however you want to see it.
I know you've seen the glass, obviously, you've seen it many times. I haven't. Could you just describe a window panel from the Nuremberg window?
So if you think about the first one, I guess is the obvious place to start. So the first one is the two witnesses, often identified as Elijah and Enoch. They appear in Revelations as the two witnesses. They're not named. They are killed by the servants of Antichrist, and then they are risen up by God as proof of his power over Antichrist. They appear here in this window. The glass is restored, which makes it more difficult, but they appear as preaching friars, basically. It also appears in illuminated manuscripts that you have them presented as Franciscans, which may indicate this is who is choosing the content of the window. So you have the two witnesses. They're kind of raised up in front of an altar, and then you have people praying around them. They look up at them. Then if we go on to the actual 15 signs, the first day is the seas rising. So in the Nuremberg version, it has a mountainous landscape and the seas are kind of billowing above it in this blue semicircle. In other examples, there would also be fish in this sea. For example, in the York one, it has a completely different interpretation in that you don't see the flood. You see the beginning of the flood, and then the inscription tells you it's flooding. So you have options. There's no you have to show the first day with the sea really high. You can show it just beginning to rise. You can show it at its height. The text is generally that it's 40 cubits above all the mountains. So you can show that, or you can show in the manuscript I mentioned earlier with the mermaids, it has people tilling the land and the sea seems to be rising towards them. There's also the Holcomb Bible, the 14th century English picture book, that shows lots of fish. It's interesting often that these fish are local fish, and they're using fish that you would have seen on a daily basis, so it adds to the familiarity. But there's also the question of who would have actually seen it. If you think this is quite a big window, how many people could actually see this right at the top of the window? And yet they're still putting all these detail in. So it matters to somebody to have it right. Is it that God can see it? Is it that the person doing it just wants to do it properly? Is there some other message that we don't know about?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. If you have a gargoyle or a high-level statue, you can only actually understand the perspective when you're down at the ground. But with windows, particularly the Apocalyptic windows, they were different.
There's also with the windows, if you think of the sun shining through them, it casts the images onto the church floor as well. So on a really sunny day, you can actually see the image in the window on the floor in front of you. So that then gives you a different perspective as well. So you've got the window, you've got the light coming through it, or you've got almost like painting on the floor. So there's all these different perspectives, there's different ways of seeing it. Which part of the church it's in means different people will see it. You can't really see them from the outside, but you know they're there from the outside. So you can see there's a window there, you can't see the content, but maybe you're remembering what you've seen when you just walk past the church. You're remembering what the window shows because you can see the window, even if you just can't see the content. So as a medium, it's very different from if you think about a book that you're consciously going to look at. In a window, you're passing by it in your daily life, or you're praying in the church, and then suddenly it's on the ground before you because the sun's come out. The medium makes so much difference.
Yes, it would. And you've just raised a question for me, which I hadn't thought of before. In Nuremberg, it's in St. Martha's Hospice. Would many people have gone there, or would it just be people staying in the hospice? Was it public place?
Well, it's for pilgrims, so it really is almost Europe-wide. Nuremberg is on main road, so it's people maybe coming down from the north of Germany on the way to Rome. So they're really pulling people in from all around in a pilgrim's hospital in a way that you're not necessarily getting in a rural parish church, which isn't on a main road. This window in particular, this church in particular, it has a huge audience potentially. As far as I know, it's not mentioned in any pilgrim accounts, like the windows or anything, but it is people coming from a very wide area.
And possibly the donors were also thinking they could attract people to come to Nuremberg and stay, see the wonderful windows, and then pass on their pilgrimage.
Yeah, and they're maybe saying, oh, I saw this window given by this family, so they're on the way down to Rome. Or they're going back home, they're saying, oh, I saw this window, I really liked it, and these people gave it, and have you heard of them? I mean, the potential is huge, but it's so difficult to know, unfortunately.
Yes, and using the word that we do now, hospice, from hospital, which is where you are sick, rather than the hospitality, which is when you'd come through.
Yeah, maybe hostel is the pilgrim's hostel, the pilgrim's hotel even. It's a different idea. It's also one of the poor acts of mercy, giving shelter to travellers, to strangers. You are then, in that way, helping your own soul as well. Benefits everybody.
Yes, it does. You've described the apocalypse scenes as floods and earthquakes. These are all what today we would call environmental disasters. They're not, one is aware now, they aren't caused by human sin. So why environmental disasters? What was implied and what was understood?
It's difficult to know for certain. It is notable that many of the depictions of 15 Last Days don't have people in. So in this one, the Nuremberg one, there are quite a lot of people. In the York one, they don't appear until the 11th day. In the Holcomb picture book, there's lots of people elsewhere, not very many at all in the images. These aren't human. It's all about the natural world. It's about trees dropping blood. It's the seas are on fire. It's definitely not a punishment from God. People are suffering the apocalypse within their own environment, and then that environment is destroyed. The world burns. It's in every version of the 15 Last Days. Like the material world is just completely destroyed, as are the people. The people are going up to heaven, they're going down to hell. It's not about the preservation of the natural world. The world just exists for people to live on. It's not a constant thing, no chance of it lasting forever, but your soul will. So you have to think about the permanence of your soul, not about the world around you. Don't get too involved. I guess that doesn't really work if you think of the heraldry and the status below, but the message is still, don't think about the physical world, think about your salvation. The physical world will be gone.
It's a very difficult and a very different concept from the way we view the world now.
It's almost the exact opposite, I guess. We're so worried about climate change. Here, the idea is it doesn't matter. Like the world around you does not matter. Your soul is the thing that matters. Your behavior is what matters. Your salvation, not like what you do in the material world. And yet you are given a window in the material world that will outlast your death. So there's this dichotomy here, but I don't think they would have seen it like that. I think for them, the material world is created by God and it will end at some point. So you can still be attached to it. You can still give the window, but don't be too attached.
Yes, that makes some sense. Don't be too attached to your wealth. Jessica, what is the approach you're taking in your research towards the Nuremberg window?
Mainly as a comparison. So the main thrust of the research is the York windows, the one that shows the 15 last days. It has been studied mainly as literary text because it is the only example of Middle English in glass. People talk about the images, but they're secondary. Whereas I'm not interested in that approach. I think you should see it as a visual object, and the words are part of that visual object. And also you should see it as a story. The idea, the Bible's for the poor. These are picture books. So people are using these windows to tell stories. To some extent that holds, to some extent it doesn't hold, because you do have the text and you do have different messages that can be taken by different people. They have these multi-layers in these windows. The clerics can have one message they get from it because they've read the Bible or they get the allusions to this. And then if you're using the window, for example, to teach children to read, they're going to get a different message. You've got a 6-year-old who's, wow, look at this earthquake. And it engages children and it does help them. So there's all these possible messages, and that's kind of what I'm looking at. Focusing on the story, so using the modern transmedial narratology, you looking at the iconography, and then just seeing what comes out of that. And I think so much comes out of it. If you just really look at the stories that are being told, and then you can, to some extent, look at the intentions. And there's so much richness, and there's so many connections. And I think that is true for any window or any piece of art. If you look at it in the right way, you'll get one thing out of it. Or you look at it in a different right way, you'll maybe get something else. But we kind of, as a methodological thing, we need to really think about the image as an image, and then how it's telling the story, or how it's maybe not telling the story, how it has just a single message. But we need to consider all these things rather than just dismissing it as art. We need to think about the people, like putting these pieces of art in the context, the historical context in which they were made, and really trying to get some idea of the people who were looking at them, the people who were making them, the people who were experiencing them.
Does that work as well in Nuremberg?
I think so, yeah. I think Nuremberg, as I said, the really interesting thing is how it is fitted into this story. And the next window finishes the story. It is the 15th day. And it's so obvious with this window. It definitely is the 15th. So you're kind of, you need to look at them within the whole experience. You can't just say, oh, look, let's look at this one panel. You can do that, but I don't think you get as much out of it as if you consider the entire church or the entire tradition, or how it interacts with text, how it interacts with politics. Just this much more holistic idea.
I've always assumed that the images were the aide de memoire for people remembering or telling their children, as you say. Yeah,
and that absolutely can be, but the ways in which they're used and the impact they make, the story they tell, the images they use, it's like going that one layer below and saying, how are they doing this? Not they are doing this, how is it being done?
Do you think the turbulent times in which the windows were created impacted the way that the 15 days were presented?
Yes and no. In terms of the apocalypse in medieval times and potentially into modern times is kind of omnipresent. There's always a reason to think about it. If you want to find something apocalyptic, you can. It's easy. The medieval people lived in a constant state of apocalyptic expectation. So even the writing of the Revelation of St. John, it was written with the expectation. Like, it just seems something very human to be constantly living in expectation of the end of days. And you can see that all the way through the surviving medieval text. So yes, they are making it with the expectation, but it's not unusual. It's always there. There's always the possibility, but it's always about your soul. It's always very personal. It's not about the material. It's about, I need to sort out my soul. I need to go to confession. The message of the window is pray.
And look after your future soul.
Yeah, always. These donor figures at the bottom, it's so much about their soul. It's about the souls of the people seeing the window. It's salvation. in the end, I think so much of the medieval world, it just comes down to salvation.
Yes, and I suppose that would also encourage people to help their neighbours, their friends.
Yeah, everybody benefits from these windows. The church, in the most basic sense, the church is made watertight. It's made beautiful. It's benefiting the souls of the donors because they're asking for prayers. It's benefiting the souls of the people who see the window because they're told about salvation. It's benefiting the priests who maybe want to preach and use it as a preaching aid. There's just so many reasons to make these things. There's so many good reasons to do it, so many convincing reasons. It's really kind of an obvious thing to do.
And here we are 500 years later, we still look at these windows and it just takes our breath away.
Yeah.
The colours and the beauty and the deep messages in there as well.
Yeah.
I do wonder what images we would have for an apocalyptic window for today.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question.
Yes. And an uncomfortable one,
Yeah.
I'm afraid. Jessica, for my final question, as the windows are about the end of time, how come they've survived?
It's pretty much luck. The stained glass in Frankfurt Oder is particularly interesting in their survival. They were taken down during the Second World War, put in storage. The Red Army came in. After the Second World War, the Soviets took the glass back to Russia. It stayed there until the end of communism. And then there was 10 years of negotiation to get them back. And it wasn't until 2002 that they came back to Frankfurt Oder. So they spent 10 years in an archive in the Hermitage or wherever they were. So it's just all these vagaries. Like in York, they survived because York wasn't particularly Protestant. No one destroyed them. They were in a kind of forgotten church. And it's just that each window has its own story to tell. Each story of luck. And it tells you, if you look at the conservation, you look at the survival, it tells you so much about the people in that particular time. So what were they doing in the 16th century? What are they doing now? How are they conserving the window now? And what does that tell you about our attitudes to the medieval period? So there's so many avenues of looking at medievalisms. And how do we restore these windows? And what are the principles? And what does that tell us about our understanding of the past? There's just so much in them.
Yes, medievalism is becoming very, very popular these days.
Yeah.
And on that cheerful note, we will have to leave it there. Jessica, thank you so much for coming in today to talk about the glass of Nuremberg's apocalyptic window.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure. Today I've been talking to Jessica Knowles about her research into Revelations in Glass, Nuremberg's apocalyptic windows. My thanks to everyone for listening. I hope you found it as interesting, informative and, can I say, illuminating, as I did. Please do look out for the next MECERN podcast, in which MECERN members and associates talk about their recent or their ongoing research into the medieval world of Central Europe. And if you have research that you or your colleagues are doing and you'd like to talk about it to MECERN members, please do contact me through the MECERN board or website administrator. I'm Karen Culver for the MECERN podcast. Thank you and goodbye until the next time.